And even if it isn't fine tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsay, raising her eyes to glance at William Banks and Lily Briscoe as they passed, it will be another day. And now, she said, thinking that Lily's charm was her Chinese eyes, aslant in her white, puckered little face, but it would take a clever man to see it. And now stand up and let me measure your leg, for they might go to the lighthouse after all, and she must see if the stocking did not need to be an inch or two longer in the leg. Smiling, for it was an admirable idea that had flashed upon her this very second William and Lily should marry, she took the heather mixture stocking, with its crisscross of steel needles at the mouth of it, and measured it against James's leg. My dear, stand still, she said, for in his jealousy, not liking to serve as measuring block for the lighthouse keeper's little boy, James fidgeted purposely. And if he did that, how could she see? Was it too long? Was it too short? She asked. She looked up. What demon possessed him, her youngest, her cherished, and saw the room, saw the chairs, thought them fearfully shabby. Their entrails, as Andrew said the other day, were all over the floor. But then what was the point, she asked, of buying good chairs to let them spoil up here all through the winter, when the house, with only one old woman to see to it, positively dripped with wet? Never mind, the rent was precisely 2 pence halfpenny. The children loved it. It did her husband good to be 3,000, or if she must be accurate, 300 miles from his libraries and his lectures and his disciples. And there was room for visitors, mats, camp beds, crazy ghosts of chairs and tables whose London life of service was done. They did well enough here. And a photograph or two and books. Books, she thought, grew of themselves. She never had time to read them. Alas, even the books that had been given her and inscribed by the hand of the poet himself, quote, for her whose wishes must be obeyed, end of quote. Quote, the happier Helen of our days, end of quote. Disgraceful to say, she had never read them. And Croom on the mind and Bates on the savage customs of Polynesia, quote, my dear, stand still, end of quote, she said. Neither of those could one send to the lighthouse. At a certain moment, she supposed, the house would become so shabby that something must be done. If they could be taught to wipe their feet and not bring the beach in with them, that would be something. Crabs she had to allow if Andrew really wished to dissect them, or if Jasper believed that one could make soup from seaweed, one could not prevent it. Or Rose's objects, shells, reeds, stones, for they were gifted, her children, but all in quite different ways. And the result of it was, she sighed, taking in the whole room from floor to ceiling, as she held the stocking against James's leg, that things got shabbier and got shabbier summer after summer. The mat was fading, the wallpaper was flapping. You couldn't tell anymore that those were roses on it. Still, if every door in a house is left perpetually open and no lockmaker in the whole of Scotland can mend a bolt, things must spoil. Every door was left open. She listened. The drawing room door was open, the hall door was open. It sounded as if the bedroom doors were open. And certainly the window on the landing was open, for that she had opened herself. That windows should be open and doors shut, simple as it was, could none of them remember it. She would go into the maids' bedrooms at night and find them sealed like ovens, except for Marie's, the Swiss girl, who would rather go without a bath than without fresh air. But then at home, she had said, quote, the mountains are so beautiful, end of quote. She had said that last night, looking out of the window with tears in her eyes. The mountains are so beautiful. Her father was dying there, Mrs. Ramsay knew. He was leaving them fatherless, scolding and demonstrating how to make a bed, how to open a window with hands that shut and spread like a Frenchwoman's. All had folded itself quietly about her when the girl spoke, as after a flight through the sunshine, the wings of a bird fold themselves quietly in the blue of its plumage, changes from bright steel to soft purple. She had stood there silent, for there was nothing to be said. He had cancer of the throat. At the recollection how she had stood there, how the girl had said, quote, at home the mountains are so beautiful, end of quote, and there was no hope. No hope whatever. She had a spasm of irritation, and speaking sharply, said to James, stand still, don't be tiresome, so that he knew instantly that her severity was real, and straightened his leg, and she measured it. The stocking was too short by half an inch at least, making allowance for the fact that Sorley's little boy would be less well-grown than James. "It's too short," she said, "ever so much too short." Never did anybody look so sad. Bitter and black, halfway down in the darkness in the shaft which ran from the sunlight to the depths, perhaps a tear formed. A tear fell. The waters swayed this way and that, received it, and were at rest. Never did anybody look so sad. But was it nothing but looks, people said? What was there behind it, her beauty and splendor? Had he blown his brains out, they asked? Had he died the week before they were married? Some other earlier lover of whom rumors reached one? Or was there nothing but an incomparable beauty which she lived behind and could do nothing to disturb? For easily though she might have said at some moment of intimacy, when stories of great passion, of love foiled, of ambition thwarted came her way, how she too had known or felt or been through it herself, she never spoke. She was silent always. She knew then. She knew without having learnt. Her simplicity fathomed what clever people falsified. Her singleness of mind made her drop plumb like a stone. A light exact as a bird gave her naturally this swoop and fall of the spirit upon truth which delighted, eased, sustained, falsely perhaps. "Nature has but little clay," said Mr. Banks once, much moved by her voice on the telephone, though she was only telling him a fact about a train, "like that of which she molded you." He saw her at the end of the line, very clearly Greek, straight, blue-eyed. How incongruous it seemed to be telephoning to a woman like that. The Graces assembling seemed to have joined hands in meadows of asphodel to compose that face. He would catch the 10:30 at Euston. "Yet she's no more aware of her beauty than a child," said Mr. Banks, replacing the receiver and crossing the room to see what progress the workmen were making with an hotel which they were building at the back of his house. And he thought of Mrs. Ramsay as he looked at that stir among the unfinished walls, for always he thought there was something incongruous to be worked into the harmony of her face. She clapped a deerstalker's hat on her head. She ran across the lawn in galoshes to snatch a child from mischief. So that if it was her beauty merely that one thought of, one must remember the quivering thing, the living thing. They were carrying bricks up a little plank as he watched them, and work it into the picture. Or if one thought of her simply as a woman, one must endow her with some freak of idiosyncrasy. She did not like admiration. Or suppose some latent desire to doff her royalty of form, as if her beauty bored her and all that men say of beauty. And she wanted only to be like other people, insignificant. He did not know. He did not know. He must go to his work. Knitting her reddish-brown hairy stocking with her head outlined absurdly by the gilt frame, the green shawl which she had tossed over the edge of the frame, and the authenticated masterpiece by Michelangelo, Mrs. Ramsay smoothed out that had been harsh in her manner a moment before, raised his head, and kissed her little boy on the forehead. "Let us find another picture to cut out," she said. But what had happened? Someone had blundered. Starting from her musing, she gave meaning to words which she had held meaningless in her mind for a long stretch of time. Someone had blundered. Fixing her short-sighted eyes upon her husband, who was now bearing down upon her, she gazed steadily until his closeness revealed to her, the jingle made it itself in her head, that something had happened, someone had blundered, but she could not for the life of her think what. She shivered. He quivered. All his vanity, all his satisfaction in his own splendor, riding, fell as a thunderbolt, fierce as a hawk at the head of his men through the valley of death. Had been shattered, destroyed, stormed at by shot and shell, boldly we rode and well, flashed through the valley of death, volleyed and thundered straight into Lily Briscoe and William Banks. He quivered, he shivered. Not for the world would she have spoken to him, realizing from the familiar signs his eyes averted in some curious gathering together of his person, as if he wrapped himself about and needed privacy into which to regain his equilibrium. that he was outraged and anguished. She stroked James's head. She transferred to him what she felt for her husband, and as she watched him chalk yellow the white dress shirt of a gentleman in the Army and Navy Store's catalog, thought what a delight it would be to her should he turn out a great artist. And why should he not? He had a splendid forehead. Then, looking up as her husband passed her once more, she was relieved to find that the ruin was veiled. Domesticity triumphed. Custom crooned its soothing rhythm, so that when stopping deliberately as his turn came round again at the window, he bent quizzically and whimsically to tickle James's bare calf with a sprig of something. She twitted him for having dispatched, quote, "that poor young man," end of quote, Charles Tansley. Tansley had to go in and write his dissertation, he said. James will have to write his dissertation one of these days, he added ironically, flicking his sprig. Hating his father, James brushed away the tickling spray with which, in a manner peculiar to him, compound of severity and humor, he teased his youngest son's bare leg. She was trying to get these tiresome stockings finished to send to Sorley's little boy tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsay. There wasn't the slightest possible chance that they could go to the Lighthouse tomorrow, Mr. Ramsay snapped out irascibly. How did he know, she asked. The wind often changed. The extraordinary irrationality of her remark, the folly of women's minds, enraged him. He had ridden through the valley of death, been shattered and shivered, and now she flew in the face of facts, made his children hope what was utterly out of the question, in effect, told lies. He stamped his foot on the stone step. Damn you, he said. But what had she said? Simply that it might be fine tomorrow, so it might. Not with the barometer falling and the wind due west. To pursue truth with such astonishing lack of consideration for other people's feelings, to rend the thin veils of civilization so wantonly, so brutally, was to her so horrible an outrage of human decency that without replying, dazed and blinded, she bent her head as if to let the pelt of jagged hail, the drench of dirty water, bespatter her unrebuked. There was nothing to be said. He stood by her in silence. Very humbly at length he said that he would step over and ask the Coast Guards if she liked. There was nobody whom she reverenced as she reverenced him. She was quite ready to take his word for it, she said, only then they need not cut sandwiches, that was all. They came to her naturally since she was a woman all day long with this and that, one wanting this, another that. The children were growing up. She often felt she was nothing but a sponge sopped full of human emotions. Then he said, damn you. He said, it must rain. He said, it won't rain, and instantly a heaven of security opened before her. There was nobody she reverenced more. She was not good enough to tie his shoestrings, she felt. Already ashamed of that petulance, of that gesticulation of the hands when charging at the head of his troops, Mr. Ramsay rather sheepishly prodded his son's bare legs once more, and then, as if he had her leave for it, with a movement which oddly reminded his wife of the great sea lion at the zoo, tumbling backwards after swallowing his fish and walloping off so that the water in the tank washes from side to side, he dived into the evening air, which, already thinner, was taking the substance from leaves and hedges, but, as if in return, restoring to roses and pinks a luster which they had not had by day. Someone had blundered, he said again, striding off up and down the terrace, but how extraordinarily his note had changed. It was like the cuckoo. In June he gets out of tune, as if he were trying over, tentatively seeking some phrase for a new mood. And having only this at hand, used it, cracked though it was. But it sounded ridiculous. Someone had blundered, said like that, almost as a question, without any conviction, melodiously. Mrs. Ramsay could not help smiling, and soon, sure enough, walking up and down, he hummed it, dropped it, fell silent. He was safe. He was restored to his privacy. He stopped to light his pipe, looked once at his wife and son in the window, and as one raises one's eyes from a page in an express train and sees a farm, a tree, a cluster of cottages as an illustration, a confirmation of something on the printed page to which one returns, fortified and satisfied, so without his distinguishing either his son or his wife, the sight of them fortified him and satisfied him and consecrated his effort to arrive at a perfectly clear understanding of the problem which now engaged the energies of his splendid mind. It was a splendid mind, for if thought is like the keyboard of a piano divided into so many notes, or like the alphabet is ranged in 26 letters all in order, then his splendid mind had no sort of difficulty in running over those letters, one by one, firmly and accurately, until it had reached, say, the letter Q. He reached Q. Very few people in the whole of England ever reach Q. Here, stopping for one moment by the stone urn which held the geraniums, he saw, but now far, far away, like children picking up shells, divinely innocent and occupied with little trifles at their feet and somehow entirely defenseless against a doom which he perceived, his wife and son together, in the window. They needed his protection. He gave it them. But after Q, what comes next? After Q, there are a number of letters, the last of which is scarcely visible to mortal eyes, but glimmers red in the distance. Z is only reached once by one man in a generation. Still, if he could reach R, it would be something. Here at least was Q. He dug his heels in at Q. Q he was sure of. Q he could demonstrate. If Q then is Q, R, here he knocked his pipe out with 2 or 3 resonant taps on the handle of the urn and proceeded. Then R, he braced himself. He clenched himself. Qualities that would have saved a ship's company exposed on a broiling sea with 6 biscuits and a flask of water, and endurance and justice, foresight, devotion, skill came to his help. R is then, what is R? A shudder like the leathern eyelid of a lizard flickered over the intensity of his gaze and obscured the letter R. In that flash of darkness, he heard people saying he was a failure, that R was beyond him. He would never reach R. On to R once more. R. Qualities that in a desolate expedition across the icy solitudes of the polar region would have made him the leader, the guide, the counselor, whose temper, neither sanguine nor despondent, surveys with equanimity what is to be and faces it, came to his help again. R. The lizard's eye flickered once more, the veins on his forehead bulged, the geranium in the urn became startlingly visible and displayed among its leaves. He could see without wishing it that obvious distinction between the 2 classes of men. On the one hand, the steady goers of superhuman strength who, plodding and persevering, repeat the whole alphabet in order, 26 letters in all from start to finish. On the other, the gifted, the inspired, who miraculously lump all the letters together in one flash, the way of genius. He had not genius. He laid no claim to that. But he had or might have had the power to repeat every letter of the alphabet from A to Z accurately in order. Meanwhile, he stuck at Q. On, then, on to R. Feelings that would not have disgraced a leader who, now that the snow has begun to fall and the mountaintop is covered in mist, knows that he must lay himself down and die before morning comes, stole upon him, paling the color of his eyes, giving him, even in the 2 minutes of his turn on the terrace, the bleached look of withered old age. Yet he would not die lying down. He would find some crag of rock, and there, his eyes fixed on the storm, trying to the end to pierce the darkness, he would die standing. He would never reach R. He stood stock still by the urn with the geranium flowing over it. How many men in 1,000 million, he asked himself, reach Z after all? Surely the leader of a forlorn hope may ask himself that, and answer without treachery to the expedition behind him. 1, perhaps. 1 in a generation. Is he to be blamed then if he is not that one, provided he has toiled honestly, given to the best of his power, and till he has no more left to give? And his fame lasts how long? It is permissible even for a dying hero to think before he dies how men will speak of him hereafter. His fame lasts perhaps 2,000 years. And what are 2,000 years? Asked Mr. Ramsay ironically, staring at the hedge. What indeed, if you look from a mountaintop down the long wastes of the ages? The very stone one kicks with one's boot will outlast Shakespeare. His own little light would shine, not very brightly, for a year or 2, and would then be merged in some bigger light, and that in a bigger still. He looked into the hedge, into the intricacy of the twigs. Who then could blame the leader of that forlorn party, which after all has climbed high enough to see the waste of the years and the perishing of stars? If before death stiffens his limbs beyond the power of movement, he does a little consciously raise his numbed fingers to his brow and square his shoulders, so that when the search party comes, they will find him dead at his post. The fine figure of a soldier? Mr. Ramsay squared his shoulders and stood very upright by the urn. Who shall blame him if, so standing for a moment, he dwells upon fame, upon search parties, upon cairns raised by grateful followers over his bones? Finally, who shall blame the leader of the doomed expedition if, having adventured to the uttermost and used his strength wholly to the last ounce and fallen asleep, not much caring if he wakes or not, he now perceives by some pricking in his toes that he lives and does not on the whole object to live, but requires sympathy and whiskey and someone to tell the story of his suffering to at once? Who shall blame him? Who will not secretly rejoice when the hero puts his armor off and halts by the window and gazes at his wife and son, who, very distant at first, gradually come closer and closer till lips and book and head are clearly before him, though still lovely and unfamiliar from the intensity of his isolation and the waste of ages and the perishing of the stars, and finally putting his pipe in his pocket and bending his magnificent head before her? Who will blame him if he does homage to the beauty of the world?